vote for Donald Trump? What do you think?
No.
Okay. Here's the question for you. Why would you ask me that in here, knowing I'm the only Jew in this room? Are you trying to get me killed? If it makes you feel any better, I vote in New York. My vote doesn't matter there. It doesn't matter here either. It doesn't matter, guys. Guys, everybody vote for whoever you want to vote. I don't care who you voted for. I'm just happy we're all here together.
So you voted for Biden.
I don't know. Why does it matter? Yeah, so what? What does it matter?
I can just tell by your jokes you voted for Biden.
Why are we talking
Alright.
about politics?
I can tell by the fact that you're still talking when nobody wants you to that you voted for Trump. Alright, make some noise if you want her to shut up. But I did ask if anybody had any questions. I didn't think it was going to be... That's on me. That was on me for thinking I could have a human interaction with somebody. That's my fault. No, look, I'm such an insecure person. Here, I'll tell you the rest of that bit, and then we'll move on. I'm so insecure. I went and got an IUD. Oh!
Okay. Yeah, come on, buddy. Thank you. Are you fucking kidding me? Yo, I'm never coming out with these group of people ever again. Straight up? Yeah.
Oh, my favorite. That was the perfect way to handle having a full beer can thrown at you on stage. I don't think you can improve on that.
I
Seriously.
salute that soldier on the front lines at Uncle Vinny's.
Yes. Yes, if you see her in real life, you have to thank her for her service and the Battle of Uncle Vinny's.
She should get to board airplanes first, and yeah, I guess that I watched the clip a couple times, but that was the first time I heard somebody who was like friends with the guy who threw the beer can go like, "This is the last time I'm coming out with this group." Oh, that was it. That was.
Yeah.
Oh man.
I want to know like the whole narrative of all the straws leading up to that one.
Yeah, exactly. I need to know more about these people. We'll probably be hearing more from them because the club said that they're pressing charges. So I think there's going to be more to the story.
I wouldn't be surprised if they're like right-wing stars soon, you know what I mean? Like persecuted because they're not allowed, for their beliefs and
Ariel's blowing up because she had the beer can thrown at her, and the guy who threw the beer can also has media appearances. He's gonna be on Charlie Kirk tomorrow.
If he beats the rap, he'll have his own show on Newsmax.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Like it is. I mean, obviously, it's like it's on one. I mean, it's very funny, but like it's also on one level, it's like kind of a nothing of an incident. But on the other hand, you can't kind of think, kind of had that nagging thought that if the politics were the other way around, this, a lot
how much
of people
it would blow up.
Yeah.
I mean, news networks love this stuff now. It's a woman being attacked. I mean, she really got it made. She really, that was a great opportunity. I'm like, what do I need to do to provoke a crowd member to do that? It's funny because of course, every comedian is talking about it now. And now there's some like Brooklyn comedians who I was talking to yesterday who are like, well, what do you expect going out there on the road? Like their version of what were you wearing? Like, they're like, you try to bring your New York material on the road and this is what happens.
And I love that on the road in this case means New Jersey.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Like she could totally take the train. Like she did take the train home after that happened.
She drove.
Okay, she
drove.
Fine.
Yeah, I just wanted to fact check that joke. You did.
Good. Live fact check. She didn't take the train. She could have. She drove home.
Yeah, and she was opening for like a very popular comedian on social media. And it's really interesting seeing his audiences, because like his jokes are just, yeah, they're kind of apolitical and like about his family. And I think he's like half Jewish too. So yeah, just a really hostile crowd.
Is the rest of her material, was it actually political at all? Do you know? Or?
No, no, not at all. Like she was like talking about, maybe she said something like pro-abortion. I can imagine that, but yeah, she was like talking about getting an IUD inserted. Like it was not at all. The woman was like clearly looking for a fight.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I know who you voted for. I could tell by the way you talked about your gynecologist, you know.
Just the like overly Jewish way you talked about your vagina. I could tell that you were not a Trump voter. But yeah, I was trying to imagine what the like pro-Biden material would be. You know, that always kills, right? The like super pro-Biden material.
Because like the Heckler was treating it as like, this is a big gotcha. You know how I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you to admit that you voted for Biden, which like, so presumably she wasn't like doing like, I don't know, Trump jokes, you know, in the set, or that wouldn't have been like a gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was like, she was clearly like trying to diffuse the moment and move on. And she didn't even want to get into politics. She's like, so I'm really insecure. And like, you know, which, yeah, it's scary out there. Who's making these spaces not safe anymore? I don't know.
Well, you know what's even scarier is if you move from the last election in the United States, it's going to be a really good transition to the election going on right now in Brazil. We have a clip here of the incumbent in that election, friend of the show, Jair Bolsonaro, and in this clip, he's it's an older clip, but it's like sort of recently come to, you know, like people have been kind of bringing it back up again. It's gotten a little bit more attention as the election is going on down there. And okay, yeah, I could share it on my end. That's fine. So in the clip, he makes a surprising statement, I think we could say, about you know, like we're all. I mean, I salute being open and adventurous about different kinds of like food that you might like go to different places, go to different kinds of restaurants. You might be a little unsure about some of the stuff on the menu, but you know, you just go for it and see how it is. Our man Jair takes that further.
Yeah. This is so funny.
Eu comecei a ver lá as mulheres índias passando com carregamento de banana nas costas. E o índio passa limpando os dentes com capim. Eu falei, o que está acontecendo? Eu vi muita gente andando, morreu um índio e eles estão cozinhando. Eles cozinham o índio. É a cultura deles. Corpo? Bota no corpo.
Mas não é para comer, não.
É para comer. Cozinha por 2, 3 dias e come com banana. E daí eu queria ver o índio sendo cozinhado. Daí o cara, se for, tem que comer. Eu falei, eu como. Daí a comitiva, ninguém quis ir. Vamos comigo lá, ninguém quis ir. Daí, como a comitiva não quis ir, que tinha que comer o índio, eu não queria me levar sozinho lá. Aí não fui. Eu comeria o índio sem problema nenhum. É a cultura deles. E eu me submeti àquilo.
One of the best. And it's like, speaking of like taking jokes too seriously, like there were no Indians who were like grilling their grandpa. He just like probably took a joke too seriously and was like, oh, that's what you guys are having for dinner?
Yeah. So for the tiny minority of our audience that doesn't speak Portuguese, and anybody in that tiny minority who doesn't have the computer in front of them as they're listening to this, or you know, it's on in the background or whatever, in that clip, Bolsonaro is very earnestly like he clearly thinks this is real. Describes going to this indigenous village in Brazil and seeing people, seeing some woman walk by with bananas and somebody walk by with, with a piece of grass they was using to clean his teeth, and says they told him that they were engaged in cannibalism. A guy just died, and they were going to cook and eat his body. And definitely the fact that Bolsonaro just thought, like, doesn't seem to have crossed his mind. They were pulling his leg. They was just like, okay, I guess that's what you guys do, huh? Like, that definitely says something about him, but also it says something about him that his next thought was, okay, I'm in. Let's do it.
And it was his staff that stopped him. They were like, no, we have dinner reservations. And like, I wanted beef barbecue, not Indian barbecue. And Brazilians love their barbecue. You could see how he got there, right? But yeah, that he was, and everybody's talking about the Jeffrey Dahmer special right now. I haven't seen it on Netflix, so I cannot make any references to it. But oh man, who knew that a world leader would use his stump to say, yes, indeed, I would eat an Indian. But has he considered other races? Just an Indian? Is he just saying, developing nature?
That's true, because he did say I'd eat an Indian.
It is a little weird that he didn't say, even if I were in that situation, which is hard to imagine, I think I would say I would eat a human. I wouldn't specify. You don't want to specify which race of human.
Yeah,
it makes it weird.
Makes it weird.
He was kind of presenting it as almost like a woke thing, like,
yeah,
he
it's
wants
their
to be part of
culture. I have
it's
to
their
respect
culture.
it.
Yeah. Not that it would come off weird at all.
A modern day Herodotus, really soaking in the different cultures. Oh man.
Yeah. And in Brazil, with the right-wing paramilitaries down there, I would hate to see what's going to get thrown at you if you admit that you voted for Lula, and while you're doing comedy.
Yeah. They're just throwing knives. They're like, let's eat him. He'd be good on the grill.
I need a comedian. Yeah.
Yeah, I need a comedian. That is, it's a slippery slope.
How's that going for him, Ben? It's isn't the next round coming up soon?
I think there are a couple more weeks. I'm not sure about the exact date, but
October 30th, right?
October 30th. Okay, very good. Yeah, she knows her stuff.
I read the article. I did read the article. I love that the indigenous is the Guardian reaches out to the indigenous people and they're like, do you guys eat your grandparents? And they're like, no, we don't do that. It could have been like a mistranslation too. Like the interpreter was just like, yeah, they're whatever, they're eating their, grandpa, who cares?
I think
I'm ready to clock out.
I think so this article is interesting. I think maybe some of our left-wing candidates could learn to be as ruthless as this. It says a television advert produced by Bolsonaro's leftist rival Lula declared Bolsonaro has revealed that he would eat human flesh. I would love Bernie to go that hard on somebody. I think, yeah. So this is like part of the Oppo research. I see that came out. Okay, cool.
Yeah, this is it's not cool to eat the poor. We eat the rich only. Okay.
That's true. It's a different menu. Bolsonaro's communications minister called Lula's advert fake news and claims the comments has been distorted.
Yeah, no, you always know you're in a good position when when it's like, well, look, that was totally taken out of context when I said that I would eat human flesh. Like, people being very unfair in how they're dredging this back up.
Yeah, Lula
If
denies.
if only Dahmer had a chance to speak about the Netflix series, he'd be like, "Yeah, I feel like everything was taken out of context."
Yeah, they try to make everything so dramatic. It wasn't really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this article is pretty gold. Lula denied spreading misinformation. I saw the footage. It's no invention. We're simply letting people know what our opponent is like. He claimed foreigners were shunning Brazil for fear of the cannibal.
Yeah.
He's trolling him so hard. In a good way, I'd argue.
Yeah.
I like it.
That election is going to be interesting.
It will, yeah, and it will also be interesting to see what happens after the election, right? I mean, I'm assuming, I'm assuming that Lula will win. He did win the first round by several million votes, and I mean, it's possible, but like that seems like the thing that would happen. But I mean, I think there's a pretty serious question about what the what Bolsonaro and his supporters would do otherwise, right? Because this is a much more, this isn't like, this isn't like the U.S. where we have like right-wing paramilitaries, but they're kind of like a sad, weird joke, that they're like, they'll get all the like Proud Boys together in the country, and it's like 150 guys, and they don't really look like they win a lot of fights, that they, there they actually have the serious version of that. So like I would imagine, I would think their January 6th could be much scarier than ours if it happened.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They definitely will bring the guns.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, I did want to just hit two more things before we bring on Matt Bruenig for the main segment tonight. So one of those is I wanted to plug coming up in 2 weeks from yesterday. So on the 23rd in Los Angeles, we and This Is Revolution and Left Reckoning are doing a live show at the Terragram Ballroom. That's 7 p.m. LA time, and it's going to be really good. Going to have Matt and David from Left Reckoning. Going to have Jason Miles and Deep State Cuba from TIR. Going to have Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila, Ryan Lake, Daniel Bessner, probably C. Derek Varn, probably a person or two I am forgetting right now. If we do want some more graphics to use to promote it. So if anybody out there in the audience wants to come up with a DIY one, we'll find some way to reward that. If you person comes up with the best one when we get around to making some merch, you can get first pick maybe. But really looking forward to that. Link to get tickets to that is in the description for the episode. And speaking of that, Anna is going to be on next week for the last episode before the live show to talk about her debate with Dennis Prager. So that should be a lot of fun. And then there's going to be no episode the day, the Monday after the live show, because I'm still going to be in Los Angeles. It's going to be David Griscom's birthday. So no episode that night, but there might be something really good coming up on the following Monday, which is also Halloween. So stay tuned on that. But the last thing I wanted to talk about before Matt is something that happened on Thursday. So since we did the last episode, Joe Biden got around to reading the article that I wrote over the summer for Daily Beast, called "Why the Hell Isn't Biden Ending the Federal War on Cannabis?" So I'm glad to see that he's caught up on his reading, but I would say that he's maybe not. He maybe needs to reread it, since if you look at the details of what he did, there is unfortunately, and I mean, I really don't want to be the person who's like always the naysayer on this stuff. I actually, when the student loan thing came down, the original, like my suggested title for Jacobin was Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness is good but not good enough, and I was actually like a little bit frustrated that they didn't include the good but part, because I wanted to be like one note negative. But in this case, I got to say, do feel pretty one note negative about this, because even though it is a tiny step in the right direction, that the people who did receive these pardons, there are all kinds of ways that being pardoned can help them in terms of housing, employment, federal student loans, stuff like that.
They vote for Joe Biden.
Well, there's that.
Hopefully those 6,000 people are just in Florida.
Yeah. Although that means they can never do stand-up comedy again unless they're dodge full beer cans. But yeah. But like it also, let's be really clear on this. It's not just that the overwhelming majority, the people who this applies to, right? Because it's not quite what he said in the campaign trail, or at least not what he always said in the campaign trail. There are times, to be fair, he did say possession, but like there are a bunch of times when he was campaigning for president, he said anybody who's in federal prison for marijuana or even nonviolent crimes. He'd even use that phrase. And there are an awful lot, like nobody who this pardon applies to is actually still in federal prison, because the expression Jake is making is the appropriate one when you first hear that's confusing, right? Here's how this works. One, the overwhelming majority of people who are busted for simple possession, which is the only thing the pardon applied to, go to state prisons. So there are, I think, about 30,000 people around the country who are in prison in state prisons. Now, fair enough, president can't pardon them. That's beyond his authority. But also, because it's simple possession, and the zeal for forcing the stuff is not what it once was. Like there are thousands of people who are in federal prison for marijuana offenses, but none of them are in for simple possession. Right? It's all like at the very least.
If you have like more than a dime bag, it means that you're trying to sell weed. And so as decriminalization happens, they're just like increasing the amount of weed you can carry. So now in DC you can carry like 2 ounces, and that could be your personal stash.
Right.
But any more than that, it's like, nope, you're trying to sell. And who knows, maybe you're just preparing for a big party.
Maybe you're about to have a party. Maybe you just like to, it's like when I used to go to the liquor store during the pandemic, like lockdown part of the pandemic, and it'd be like, all right, I don't want to go to the store again for a while, so.
I need the Costco version of weed, and the government is stopping you from that. That's what exactly. Americans love to do most, is buy things in bulk, and we should be allowed to do that.
Definitely. So there are a few thousand people who are in prison who had more than the simple possession allowable amount. None of them are getting out. And some of these cases are really bad. I mean, because you can, we're talking about like actually lots of cases. Standing Music, who I've talked about in the show before, but like that's like one sort of interesting picturesque case. But like there are tons of people who are completely nonviolent, but they just had too much weed or whatever. Perhaps even we're busted trying to sell it, which I don't.
Which who cares? I mean, that's it. It happens in every middle school. Like, get over it. But I mean, another part of the decriminalization thing. So weed is like Schedule 1 still. So it's nearly impossible to do like medical testing on it, because the federal government needs to obtain its weed a certain way in order to do this testing. So it's like a catch-22 where you can't do the testing since it's Schedule 1, and then you can't legalize it because you don't have the tests that prove that it's benign on people.
Yeah, you can't have right, like, yeah, I mean, legislatively you could if that was possible, but like, but yeah, given the way the law is set up right now, it's very difficult for the federal government to go through the procedures that its current policy commits it to going through to take it off of Schedule 1. So at the very goddamn least, you could let people out of prison. And so it's kind of like Sleepy Joe got up for a minute to go to the bathroom, but like he's kind of back to sleep now. And I think it's a distinction that should be tracked.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a teeny tiny step in the right direction. It's too bad, that most of the government can't smoke weed because they get random drug tests. So what we need is Joe Biden smoking a blunt, and then
that would be fun.
Will win over hearts and minds.
That sounds like a 2005 comedy I would have watched. The quest to get the president to smoke with you. So fair enough. Naomi, where can people find your stuff?
I'm Naomi Caravani on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I will be at the Cellar Wednesday, opening for Jim Norton at 7 p.m. And Friday, I have a show in Gowanus at Halyards called Bitches Brew. You can check it out, Bitches Brew Comedy on Instagram.
Very nice. All right.
Thank you for having me. This is so much fun.
All right. Thank you. All right. So we are now joined by the man, the myth, the legend, Matthew Bruenig. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great. How are you, Ben?
I am pretty good. So yeah, been hoping to to get you on for a while. Been a fan of a lot of what you've put out for years, and I thought one of the most interesting things that that we could talk about would be socialism, since I know you've written a decent amount over the years about how sort of realistic we could realistically envision something that we would think of as a post-capitalist society coming about or working, which is something that I think historically a lot of people on the socialist left haven't really said nearly as much about as they should. Like, they're very vague about it. So do you want to just kind of start us off with like how you kind of generally think about the issue?
Yeah, as a kind of 101 starting point, what I would usually do is say, first things first, let's distinguish the welfare state from socialism, right? The welfare state is a system of programs to provide for various populations or to provide healthcare, provide education. Those are benefits. That's not socialism, right? Socialism is a separate thing that deals with how production is organized in society. Specifically, who's going to control and own companies for the most part, right? The productive entities that organize production day to day. And so, under the capitalist model, you have a kind of shareholder capitalist firm where you have, there's this company, and at the top of the company, you have shareholders who own the equity. They appoint board members. Those board members appoint a CEO. The CEO manages the company, primarily with a goal of trying to make as much money for the shareholders. And what we're trying to do is switch out essentially that corporate governance arrangement and create a different corporate governance arrangement where, and this is where things obviously start to spiraling in lots of different directions and where you get a lot of the fighting. But broadly speaking, we want to replace this shareholder class with some other constituency, whether that's society, whether that's the workers in each firm, whether that's, some combination of the above. We're trying to replace that shareholder group with another group that we think of as representing, the proper socialist constituency who should actually operate ownership and control and make these productive decisions and also benefit from production.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, I guess just to go back to the first thing that you said about socialism and the welfare state. I mean, one way you might think of this is that, like, one of the core things that socialists have always objected to about current economic arrangements is that people are dependent on markets for things that maybe they shouldn't have to be. And some of which might bleed into sort of social democratic welfare state concerns, but some of which has to do with class divisions, with the idea that we shouldn't have a class of people who own the means of production, by which we presumably always mean something much broader than what people are typically thinking of when they use the word production. The means of production and stuff like that. And distribution, exchange, extraction, all that stuff, and then a class of people who have to work for them, right? The one traditional socialist objection to capitalism is that you have to in order to make a living, you have to submit yourself to a capitalist, by like signing an employment contract with them. I noticed somebody in the chat asked about, the sort of caring more about production or distribution. And like one way you might think about this as well, look, one of the things we object to about capitalism is that we hate the kind of distribution it gives rise to. We think it's like a really bad distribution, but you might think that that's downstream of, or at least partially downstream of, the means of production being in the hands of only part of the population.
Well, it's important also to and that this can be a little cutesy, but distribution, the word would apply to different quantities. So usually when people say production or distribution, after the word distribution, they're implying income or consumption, right? But obviously also ownership is distributed and control is distributed. So in a way, it's all an objection to distribution. It's just different quantities. The socialists will tend to focus more on control and ownership, and there's a whole other group of people who maybe are less concerned about that and are interested in income and final consumption, And there's overlap as well, of course. So,
yeah, I mean, you might also think that, like, okay, one of the, you can look at the problem of income and final consumption being distributed in a really horrible, inegalitarian way, and say, this is at least partially caused by ownership and control being distributed in a terrible way. That if Amazon were owned by the state, or it were a worker co-op, or like any number of other arrangements that'd be really different from the existing one, you wouldn't have like Jeff Bezos getting so much of the income that's generated by Amazon that he could do things like go into space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because ownership is going to determine a couple of things. One, who gets the profit share of the firm, and capital income, which flows out to owners, is usually about 30% of all income. And right now it's flowing mostly to the top 10%, like overwhelmingly. So if you capture that, which you would in a socialist economy, however you exactly organized it, then you're going to have a more equal society. And then, like you point out, the way that they use their levers of control can also cause inequality through determining, for instance, how income is distributed inside a firm among workers, whether top executives are paid, 10 times as much, 5 times as much, 100 times as much, whatever, right? That's also being decided by the controller. So
Okay.
in part, I suppose you could, bring in other factors, but
Fair enough. Jake, do you want to jump in with anything before we move on to the next part of this?
Well, yeah, unless this is the next part. I mean, I've listened to your podcast. Big fan of the show, by the way. But I have an idea of where you might be on this. But you're mentioning that there's two camps, right? Who care, on which side, like where we're focusing our efforts as socialists. So I was wondering which camp you describe yourself as part of.
Yeah, and I guess I was really thinking more saying like conceptual camps. In practice, if you in the history of socialism, I think most socialists have been motivated by egalitarian impulses one way or another. Obviously, some will deny this, and we can go into this sort of psychoanalysis of why they deny this, and maybe they're sincere. I don't know, but even if you take them for what they are, most people who have called themselves socialists clearly are strongly motivated by an egalitarian sort of political ethos, and I think that ethos really pushes you in both directions, right? You need egalitarian distributions of consumption and income, as well as ownership and control. You're trying to get egalitarian distributions across the board. I would say where you have seen some distinction is with groups of people that Rawls would call welfare state capitalists, people who only concern themselves with sort of achieving some kind of egalitarian final distribution of income and do not care at all about how ownership and control is organized. But none of those people, that's nobody here. None of the intra left, I feel like, tends to be in that group. That would be sort of like your center left, I guess, or Dims. But even they, I don't know, even they are not maybe that far left even, which is funny to think about. But yeah, these are conceptual groups. For me, I say all the above. And I also think the welfare state is an important institution. Even in a socialist economy, you would want to have a welfare state. So,
yeah, which is, I guess theoretically, like a logically possible combination of positions somebody could hold would be socialism, yes, welfare state, no. But like, I
called that I coined that desertist socialism in one of the posts I wrote a long time ago. And I said, I don't know anyone. I've had to invent this term because I've never actually seen it, but you could imagine a society in which they were saying, look, it's almost Randian in its sort of completeness. The workers must get it all. And I mean that quite literally. If you're disabled, if you're, too old to work, I'm sorry, you're out of luck,
So this is kind of like an open take sphere that someone could adopt. Like,
yeah, it's in the set of possible positions, but I have not seen anyone really
just
fully
sitting out
commit.
there waiting for somebody to
someone should take it. I think
actually advocate it. But yeah, I think there are people who have said things that taken literally would entail that, but I don't think any of them actually like sort of thought through the implications. Like so like historically famous example would be in the Congress that started what would become the German Social Democratic Party, the people, the faction around Lassalle had this program that got adopted, the Gotha program that has this line in it about how workers should get the full products of their labor. And one of, Karl Marx in Critique of the Gotha program, one of his big objection status, hold on guys, really, right? Like, because what about, that's one of his examples. He uses some, he's writing before the welfare state as we know it exists, so he uses some phrase like poor relief, right? But like, what about that, right? What about schools and hospitals? What about building new factories?
Yeah. No, he's saying first things first, we got to put money aside for administration. We got to put money aside to replace the worn out machines. And then, though he doesn't use the term, he's like, then of course we have to put money aside for the welfare state. And then only after that should workers get paid. That's actually how he presents it in his critique, which that's always a fun one to throw in the face of certain kinds of people online. I don't really know what to do with him being like, of course the welfare state would take priority over worker wages in a final system. But
look, yeah, because some people kind of are. Some camps are sort of looking down on redistribution, right? Like of income and the welfare state as just this like social democracy, right? That doesn't have to do with like real communism, or is that kind of a tendency that you're responding to at time? Yeah.
People do think that, like, people do say that, but even people who say that, I think, would still say that, like, under whatever they would consider to be real socialism, like we're still going to like it's not like children and disabled people don't get any sort of consumption.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you have a couple of tendencies there. One, you got people who just don't think about it, and they think, because there's this thought that the welfare state only exists to really patch up the problems caused by low wages, and so you fix that and you fix the problem, and it's like, no, that we kind of, that's a thing that sort of circulates in the society. That's just not really true, right? I mean, unless you mean like literally like zero wages, because there's most people who are receiving benefits have zero to no wages, right? Because they're disabled or old or whatever. You've got that problem. You got people who haven't thought it through at all. Then you do have a somewhat more sophisticated take that is it's kind of like, well, the welfare state is this ameliorative class compromise project, and that then bleeds into this kind of accelerationist almost tendency to be like, this is really preventing us from getting a real hardcore revolution because it takes so many of the edges off the system.
Right. Although even there, I mean, that's presumably like we're having, if we're, if you're going to say we shouldn't have Social Security because then we won't have a socialist revolution, presumably like after the socialist revolution, there'll still be some sort of equivalent of Social Security.
Yeah. It's an order of events. It needs to happen after, we only get the old age pension after. That's when we need to implement, I suppose.
Yeah, until then.
We need them for the army now.
Yeah, I don't know. That is a weird example. It's like, well, but these people are defined by their diminished physical capacities. So I don't know that they're great agents of guerrilla war and whatnot. But
there is that. Okay. So thinking of so there's the welfare state piece. And then there's the like what happens to the means of production piece, right? So do you want to talk a little bit more about what your view is about that part?
Yeah, I think I wrote a piece a long time ago called "Identifying Socialist Institutions in Socialist Countries," which is another way to try to avoid another trap that you fall into. The first trap being conflating the welfare state with the socialist control and ownership, and then the second is getting too mixed up with whether an economy or a country or a society is socialist, versus, to my mind, a much more useful way to talk about it, which is whether a particular institution is socialist, a particular company, a particular productive unit. And so what defines whether a unit of production is socialist, that would be, mostly oriented around who owns and controls it. So to give some concrete examples, the public schools are a good example, I think, of productive units that are organized socialistically. In a conventional public school system, it's set up just like any other firm, I mean, in a kind of structural sense, except you have a school board that's elected by the local people instead of a corporate board that's elected by shareholders and then go out to seek a CEO that then is trying to make money that they can then kick out to shareholders. So by just kind of toppling the shareholders and replacing them with voters, you now have this productive unit that is, I would say, a socialist institution. And, you can go on down the board. Another example, so usually people would call that a general government service. Like in the OECD classification, that would be like one form, right? It's because it is production. It's not just sending money out to people. You're actually organizing a productive service, and it's being organized this way. And then you have this other form, which is called a state-owned enterprise, which is very similar to the general government service, except the users pay more of a fee. So the Postal Service would be an obvious example. You pay your stamps, but there's no external owner of the Postal Service. It's owned by the federal government. They have a board. The board's appointed by the president, which is confirmed by the Senate, and on, right? The Tennessee Valley Authority is another example. Amtrak is another example. Public utilities throughout the country, of which there are hundreds, thousands, depending on how you all add it up, is the same thing. We've got lots of public electric utilities, public water utilities. They all kind of structure the same way. And then beyond that, you have the social wealth fund approach, where instead of kind of setting up each entity as being 100% state owned, you create a fund with money, very much like a mutual fund or a pension fund, and you go out and you kind of buy dispersed assets and disperse control over existing firms. And then I would say the last one is the worker co-op kind of model, where the workers in each firm would become the shareholders, and then they would appoint the board, and then off you go. So it's all kind of about replacing the shareholder and replacing how the board is elected. And if you replace them in certain kinds of ways, I would say those are socialist institutions, and we're just trying to get that as widespread as we can. That's my perspective on it, at least.
Okay, yeah. So you said at the beginning of all that you think that it's like sort of maybe a less productive question, what counts as a socialist country as opposed to socialist institutions, because you just want to, you just want to promote socialist institutions as much as possible, and what counts as having promoted them so much that it's a socialist country now is sort of a secondary question. But I mean, it is maybe worth lingering on that for just a minute, because I think that intuitively there is this kind of concept that people can have of, having like, okay, economies in general are, almost invariably, mixed economies of one kind or another. Like for, most of the history of feudalism, there were non-feudal institutions, going on, right? There were like free towns and stuff like that. But we think of, maybe I think like we would think of like, I don't know, the United States is an easy example as a capitalist country, because we think like capitalist economic institutions like are dominant in a certain way in the economy. Whereas when we're thinking about a socialist future, I mean, I don't necessarily, it doesn't bother me necessarily if I sort of imagine a society that's everything that I dream that it ever could be, if like there are, I don't know, like there are like small amounts of wage labor going on here and there, because like it doesn't really, like if you have like I don't know, a podcast, right? That could be like, well, doesn't really, it doesn't really make money, it's like, it could be that like you have like, there's like one guy's working for it and it's like 3 hours a week, and is this really, like how are you going to organize that, right? And so
this hits close to home, this example.
The sole proprietor exception.
Yeah, let's call him Jake, the guy who works the podcast, but our character in our example. But yeah, so it's like, but that's maybe doesn't bother me that much if it's like a small enough part of the economy that like people don't really depend on sort of traditional capitalist wage labor as the sort of the thing you have to do in order to make a living. I mean, is that I would be curious about how you think about like those sorts of examples, like maybe the question, the sort of like what would count as like, all right, life is imperfect, but what would count as like a sort of reasonable degree of success in achieving an economy that's dominated by the institutions you want to dominate it?
Yeah, it's a hard line drawing problem. I've tried to figure out where other people have drawn this in the past. I actually asked Brad DeLong this question a while ago, and he told me that it would need to be that 65% of GDP was organized through these productive, through institutions in that way. And I was like, you know what, if you add up Norway, it's like 54, like it's really close. And Lane Kenworthy actually just wrote a book about democratic socialism. And I think he used 60%, but I think he was using a percentage of employment. So not percentage of GDP. So 60% of workers were in those firms, those socialist, more organized institutions. So We really want to hit that binary classification. It's very hard to do, and I'm not even against doing it. I think you're right. Of course, like we can identify that some societies have more of their systems organized this way than others, and the U.S. is much more organized in this sort of private ownership way, and then other countries are less so. And we're moving in that direction. I don't know how you ever get over any particular line. But I also think that there are some practical benefits to this kind of approach, which is that these questions that you were hitting upon, which is, well, what do we do about each and every productive unit? It's kind of, you can push those way down the line and say, well, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit where it's very clear how you could socialize. If you wanted to socialize Walmart, I mean, it would be as easy as just buying out the shares, and using taxes on the rich to finance that kind of thing. And now you've got that, and that's really that's an easy lift. Like, no one's going to be really all that, I say, perturbed if you knock off the Waltons and now you have a publicly owned Walmart that otherwise, is operating somewhat similarly. And you could go down the line and you find you're 50-60% of the way there with stuff that's really not all that controversial before you start getting into some genuinely thorny issues around podcasts. You were focused on the fact that, well, it's not an employee kind of relationship, but an even bigger issue there is a personal expression, right? We don't want purely state-owned media, I wouldn't imagine. So we want to allow some in the creative arts. We want people to be able to probably do some things privately, So.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you could have, you could, of course, have like media, co-ops. I mean,
Co-ops, yeah.
It's not like those don't already exist. That sort of, that takes away maybe some of the freedom of expression worry. But even with co-ops, like I don't know. I remember seeing I think like there is like a little bit of I mean, maybe it's not worth dwelling too much on these sort of line drawing questions, but I mean, like there is, I think, like any sort of realistic co-op, certainly actually existing co-ops don't don't offer like membership to like everybody who like, I mean, if they like advertise they need somebody to come in and help out for 2 weeks, right? They don't become a voting member of the co-op because they did that.
Well, and if you wanted to start your own media thing, I mean, I guess you could, by law, require that as you're getting bigger, it needs to be a co-op. But if I can't get into one of the existing media co-ops, but I have something that I would like to publish, I should probably be able to publish that on my own to the extent that that's possible, right? So what would that be? A post, I guess, but.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, you could also, I think you could also maybe have, I think, I mean, this is something I was thinking about a little bit last year when the current affairs blow up happened, and the sort of initial way that was represented was that it was about, turn it into worker co-op or not. I think the more I saw of the, he said, she said of that, the more it seemed like, okay, there are like 6 people who have, full-time jobs here, and like 5 of them have board seats anyway. So it's like the actual gap between what existed and that was like a little bit unclear to me, but like stepping back a little bit from the specifics of that case and just thinking about the more general issue in the abstract, I mean, I can see maybe in some cases like that, or like, it doesn't even have to, like, that's a political example, but I mean, it could even like be like, we could think about like artistic ones with, it's like, I don't know, like a movie, right? It might be, there might be some advantage to giving certain kinds of dictatorial power to like one person in a movie production scenario. But even there, maybe there are ways to sort of separate out this like kind of creative control from like, general business decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, and these pieces of the firm, they can be split into different sections, and that goes into another part of this debate, I guess, and where people divide on different things, right? So, for example, in my preferred system, some people are real into worker co-ops. They're real. That's like the be all end all. I'm more lukewarm on them, and instead I will say, well, I'm actually more interested in state-owned enterprises and social wealth funds and I guess general government services, but those are very similar to state-owned enterprises. And the way they'll come back is they'll be like, well, that'll just be the state kind of dictating what happens to the workers in the firm, and now that's sort of like a state capitalist almost. It's like just recreating the problem. And then you can come back and you can say, well, look, actually, right, we can kind of hybridize all of this, right? So the state could be the owner, and then the state could control a certain amount of the board seats, meaning that they get to appoint people to be on those seats, 2/3, half, whatever. And then the workers in each firm could control some of the board seats. So maybe they get to appoint 1/3 of the board. And then separately, so separate from just like top executive control, you also have the question of workers' wages and conditions. That doesn't necessarily need to be something that goes through the board. That can be something that's negotiated through a union, even in a state-owned situation. So you would have, state ownership. You'd have a mixed board appointed by both the state and other entities, especially workers in the firm. Then the working conditions would be hived off into a union contract negotiated by a sector union. And then in each like establishment little workshop, you would have like your union steward, and they would do certain kinds of things. And so, you can kind of disperse it out into different entities and chop it up and get what you want out of it. Of course, what I'm describing basically describes, the Nordic model. In those countries, the workers are entitled to appoint up to 1/3 of the board. The wages and conditions are set with sector agreements, and there's a lot of state ownership. That seems to work well, and you can see it's not like an all or nothing. It's kind of a mixture of state ownership and kind of co-op style power,
Jake, was there something you want to throw in?
Oh yeah. Well, we have this question, which I think we might want to get to. But first, I was just thinking of if you could speak a little more on why you're less hot on the worker co-op model versus the state-owned enterprises.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll preface this with, I'm not here to go after the co-op people. There are some ideas on the left that I find misguided enough to spend time on, but this is not one of them. I don't think it's all that misguided. It's just among the options, not my favorite one. So here are a couple of the issues with it, right? So first, workers don't work at the same firm for their whole life or even necessarily long periods of time. So like your average worker, by the age of 50, they've worked 11 different jobs. And, maybe in a co-op world that would go down some to 8 or 7 or whatever. But it's not clear to me that when workers kind of situate themselves in the economy, that they actually situate themselves in firms, like that's kind of like what they identify with, and they certainly move between firms, and we should encourage workers to move between firms. If a job opens up in another firm that you're good at and you would be a good candidate for, it behooves everyone if you move over to that firm. But the kind of co-op model where you are a worker owner of the firm you happen to be in really kind of frustrates that sort of mobility. What I would say is, in my opinion, workers tend to identify, and maybe this might even be changing, but historically they will identify with their trade or with their sector, right? So you might have someone who's an auto worker, but they're willing to work at all sorts of different automobile companies. It doesn't really matter. Or I remember when I was in the machinist union, there were aerospace workers. When I worked for the machinist unions, there were aerospace workers that would hop between the different aerospace companies, no problem. And they kind of had an identification as an aerospace worker in the sector, but not really with any particular firm. And this actually reminds me of the Swedish situation, because when the Swedes were with the Meidner plan, they were gonna go full-blown kind of socialism. They were gonna do that on the sector level. So not worker co-ops in each firm, but all the workers in each sector were gonna own all the firms in each sector, which makes a lot more sense to me, like if you're gonna do it non-governmentally. The other issues are, firm boundaries, like company boundaries, are actually kind of arbitrary. It just kind of depends on how you want to construct your firm, how much of it you do in-house and how much of it you outsource. So one example I like to use on this is cafeteria workers in tech companies. So you can have like Google and Twitter, they're side by side. They both have their little cafeterias that everyone likes to talk about. Well, one of the companies, the cafeteria workers may directly work for the company, like let's say Google. And then the other one, the cafeteria workers, it's an outsourced thing. They work for Aramark or whatever. So whether you work for Google or whether you work for Aramark, is very, very thin decision making that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But it would have a huge impact on what you get to vote on and what your like dividend share of the economy would be, right? If you got to be a Google worker instead of an Aramark worker, then now you're making big bucks. And another related point is just that firms, their income, like their capital income, which is what we're trying to redistribute, their profit shares, are driven by things that have, in many cases, little to do with the kind of mix of workers they have. I guess another way to put it is different firms have different capital intensities, right? So in some industries, especially like primary sectors like natural resources or even manufacturing, each worker is backed by a ton of machinery. And for that reason, that firm can be quite profitable. And so the workers in that firm, in a co-op world, they now get their wages plus this massive profit that is related to the machines that are backing them. But then you have a personal services company where there's not a lot of capital backing the worker and there's not a lot of profit, razor thin. You hear about restaurants or retail, 1-2% margins, very low margins. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? Because it's not really that the worker in the factory is like all that different from the worker in like the retail firm. It just happens to do with the kind of industry they're in. So I could go on and on, but it's to me not an ideal way to organize it for lots of different reasons. So.
Yeah, I did want to jump in on that a little bit. I mean, I'm thinking about this. So if one objection is, and I actually agree with a lot of what you said, in terms of thinking about plurality of socialist institutions and thinking that some of them might be more appropriate for some things than others. I mean, I think that maybe at the intersection of sort of socialism, properly speaking, and welfare statism, and the way you were cutting it up earlier, like I wouldn't particularly want like a worker co-op health insurance company. I don't think that would be better than the regular private health insurance company. I'd like that to be directly state owned and provision outside of the market. But I did want to push on the sort of point about I guess like sector to sector or even company to company and kind of inegalitarianism as a worry about co-ops, because when you were kind of listing off what you'd see as socialist institutions earlier, we talked a lot about co-ops, talked about state-owned enterprises like the post office, and whatever general government services, but anyway, whatever state-owned enterprises that aren't charging their users at the point of use. But one that you just kind of mentioned very briefly was social wealth funds, where actually, let me just, before I even go on and ask the question I wanted to ask, just because different people might have different levels of familiarity with what you're talking about there. Could you just like talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, a social wealth fund is like any investment fund kind of on the outside. So a bunch of money comes into the fund and they go out. the fund managers go out and just buy equity, bonds, real estate, just like any other fund would. What's novel about it is that the fund is publicly owned and that the return on the fund is able to be used for public purposes. Alaska has probably the most interesting version of this in the world right now. They take royalties that they receive on oil and gas exploration. They go out, they buy the diversified portfolio of bonds and stocks and real estate, and that portfolio generates a return, and they just send that return out as a check to every Alaskan. Everyone gets an equal dividend each year. So, yeah, that's the basic thrust of it, and it becomes like a socializing vehicle because if you buy enough of the stock and the bond and the bonds and the real estate of the world, like eventually you have it all, or you have 10, 20, 30% of it, and that becomes a very substantial amount of social ownership. So
yeah, so this is what I was a little bit curious about, because certainly if we're thinking of social wealth funds as a socialist institution in themselves, and this is like a form of social ownership, then certainly any concerns, okay, I think maybe I know how you'll answer it, but I am curious, right? Certainly on the face of it, right, the concerns about inequality between sectors or businesses are definitely going to apply at least as much to company working for people who work for different companies that all might have a certain chunk of the company owned by social wealth funds, or maybe even if we're thinking about a really distant socialist future here, I don't know, maybe like various competing social wealth funds that are all ultimately owned by the government, or like maybe even the only thing that owns shares of companies. But even so, even if that was the case, to the extent that at least part of people's income comes from wages, you'd still presumably have pretty considerable inequality between people who work for corporations with like tighter or less tight profit margins, even if those were all owned by various social wealth funds.
So the unequal distribution of wages is not resolved by the social wealth fund. The social wealth fund resolves the unequal distribution of capital income, and that's a unique. That's a very big win for it, but it does not solve the other problem. So, I mean, not directly, I suppose, in a way. Now, if you get big enough, the social wealth fund is able to exert so much influence over the board, and then it can start making headway as a real social owner that starts making judgments like this. Like in Norway, they have these guidance letters and memos that they put out that indicate how they're going to vote on things and what they're going to vote for when shareholder resolutions come up. So a lot of companies, I think most companies, I don't know if this is a regulatory thing, but they have say on pay, meaning that the pay of the CEO and a lot of top executives does have to be ratified by the shareholders, not just the board. And they put out guidelines saying, look, we're not going to vote for a CEO pay package if it, exceeds A, B, and C, and they have all these rules, and they regularly vote against pay packages that are presented to them. Now, they're not a big enough fish, to swing the elections typically. But, you could imagine, well, if they got big enough, now you have a real problem on your hands because you need them to vote for these pay packages. So.
Yeah, no, that sounds nice. So, okay, I want to, one thing I think maybe when you're kind of envisioning okay, here's how social wealth funds in Nordic countries, work right now. And right now they don't control the bulk of these companies, or whatever. So what they want isn't necessarily decisive, but then we could imagine extrapolating forward a version of them that did. And I guess that gets at the other thing I wanted to ask about social wealth funds, because I think sometimes watching or reading you talk about this, I'm a little bit unclear about whether these are thought of mostly as a sort of transitional thing, as a kind of means to the end of increasing state ownership, or as what in the long term you'd want state ownership to look like, right? Like is it that we have, I don't know, social wealth fund, buys up Walmart until it's majority, until it has a majority of the shares, and then it just Walmart just eventually is operated the way the post office is, or is it that we're really imagining a version of socialism where, at least for large chunks of the economy, I'm not saying it's not a significant difference, but the biggest structural difference between just regular corporate capitalism would just be that a different entity is owning the shares.
Right, and that the profit gets redistributed to everyone in society and all that stuff. So the way, you'll be surprised, of course, but I like how I've seen Finland and Norway organize this a little bit. So they have. I was reading their state ownership documents, of course, like you do, and I was very interested in the way that they've organized some of this stuff. So each of them have a portfolio of state-owned enterprises, which are fully, so like the post office type thing. And it's not like 3 or 4, it's like 70 or 80, and then they also have social wealth funds. They have domestic social wealth funds. Norway has the international one. And one of the interesting questions is, well, what's going on here? Like, why don't you just pick one or the other? Or why don't you just sell the state-owned enterprises and use that to buy shares? You don't need both. It seems weird to have these in parallel, right? And the answer that they give is that the state-owned enterprises that they own typically have dual purposes. So you can think about some companies in a socialist future where it only has a kind of commercial purpose, in the sense that it's just kind of like producing a certain thing for people to buy. It doesn't really have any other specific social goal, just stamping out plastic spoons, what do we got something we're trying to do with the plastic spoon maker? Not really. Just make the spoons, make a profit, send the profit up. We'll use it to send checks to people or fund healthcare or whatever. But then you have other firms where you have a social purpose in mind. It's not just the commercial purpose. And for those, you want to put those in the state-owned enterprise portfolio, right? Because then you want to have a much stronger hand. And so the post office would be a good example, because the post office has a kind of purely commercial purpose in some cases, just moving boxes around, but it also has a social purpose in that it's required to make sure that every address in the country can move stuff around at a fair, reasonable price or whatever. And so it undertakes money-losing operations in large parts of the country, especially in rural parts of the country, to satisfy that social obligation. And so for there, it makes sense. We want to have a state-owned enterprise where we can kind of, move the dials a little bit more, have more of a hands-on control, because we have not just the commercial purpose, but also the social purpose. When you start moving into firms that only have kind of commercial purposes, then that might make more sense for a social wealth fund type arrangement, because for the most part, that's going to be a much more hands-off affair where we're not, leave it to the union, leave it to the co-determined board to kind of work out day-to-day stuff,
Right, that makes sense. So, and in this case, and in this sort of, I don't know, ideal state version of this, the co-determined board. So just to be clear about that, we're talking about a board of directors that has some people who are on it, who are appointed by the owners of the company, who would ultimately be social,
the social wealth fund bureaucrats would put together a slate of directors,
Okay, but then you'd also have the, but then also the union or something would also have get to pick a certain number of board seats.
Right. And then the majority of the board would have to vote on any given thing, So for the most part, you'd need both, especially since the social wealth funds appointees are probably not these are not voting as a slate, it's just individuals, so.
Right. I guess if they were, Yeah, I mean, if they were voting as a slate, that might be a reason to want there to be like a plurality of funds that might have like, so I don't know, future socialist Walmart, might be like owned by multiple entities, which were all themselves ultimately owned by the government, but there might be some reason to not consolidate them all into one big thing.
Sure, yeah. You can also you can go very pluralistic with the board as well. We usually think about the owners and the workers, some split whether the owner's public or private, and then the workers with the co-determined board. There's not, in principle, not any reason why you couldn't set aside a board seat for the customers of the company or whatever. I've always wondered, and I think I did find eventually there were some school boards that did this. Why don't the school boards set aside one seat for the teachers, and then one seat for the parents, and then you have the other 6 or 7 elected? Like, that would be a nice little plural board. Everyone's got a voice on it, and so you can get really creative with the boards. There was one proposal I saw to create. I thought this was a crazy proposal, but it shows the level of creativity you can engage in it. Was to create bicameral boards in each company, with one of the chambers being elected entirely by workers, and the other chamber elected entirely by the owners, and you have to get the majority in each chamber. So not a majority. I mean, it would be a majority overall as well, just by definition, but specifically a majority in each chamber. And yeah, like I said, I think that's a crazy idea, but it gives you a sense of how creative you can be with the board situation if you want.
Right. Or certainly you could have like people, presumably the social wealth funds are by and large operating from higher levels of government. You could have people who represent the local community in some way, who are, after all, also impacted by the firm's decisions.
Yeah, and the social wealth fund is ultimately governed by the elected representatives, and they have certain interests. Hopefully, they're wanting to put some people on there that people will like and that will make good decisions. So hopefully, you wouldn't see too much jockeying on. I don't know. I don't think it would be too malicious for the most part. Who you're putting on the head of the board of some, mostly insignificant company. So,
right. Jake, you wanted to, I think that I was going to ask something that was a little bit more, directed at some of the like details of intra-left discussion about this, and we'll get back to that. But Jake, I think you there was a question that you picked out of the chat earlier. I think you wanted to say something about earlier.
Oh no, I just wanted to give a chance to address the question. It was about like the anarchist opposition to some of this is like, oh well, then the state isn't withering away. Obviously, this is a big source of major disagreement amongst socialists. But I was wondering like what you would say to those folks, both you and Matt, Matt and Ben, I guess.
Yeah, well, let's let the guest jump in on that first.
Yeah, I mean, it's not withering away. I'm fine with that, not to short shrift the person, but like that's a quote from Marx, I believe, right? So you could go into what does that mean from a like interpretive standpoint, and I've seen those debates, and I'm very tired of them, frankly, at this point. But obviously, some people will come in and say, well, by the state, that actually point, when he uses that word, he's actually talking about a specific kind of capitalist state, and that will wither away. And I don't know, like who knows if it was even fully clear in his own head, But yeah, I'm fine with like a government in elections, and when I'm open to alternatives. When I have gone down the rabbit hole of looking into alternatives, frankly, for the most part, I find people recreating a state that they don't call a state, to deal with certain issues around conflict resolution and stuff like that. So,
yeah, I mean that would pretty much be my position on that. I mean, I do think that Marx and Engels, when they talk about it, I mean, I think Engels has a line somewhere where it says, instead of a state, you would just have a sort of neutral administration of things, which, you know, whatever that means. But also, I think that to the extent that I can follow the thought there, it's I just think they're wrong about that, right? You know, because I think that the idea that like all you sort of, that you don't have a state if it's not expressing like class conflict, domination of one class over another, you just have some sort of, and I think like a lot of things a lot of anarchists would say about this are very similar, you know, you just have some sort of, well, look, maybe there's some kind of coordinating function you still have or something, but that's not really a state anymore. I think it underestimates the sources of political conflict that come from things other than class struggle. That's like certainly a really important source of political conflict, but I don't think it's the only one. I think that even in a socialist society that was much more different from contemporary capitalism than the one we've been describing, right? If you sort of imagine that like someday in the future we get really, really good at figuring out how to plan things without needing market mechanisms at all. Okay, I mean, you're still going to get conflicts between different regions and sectors. You're going to get conflicts about how to use resources. You can do the fun Star Trek you want and imagine, you know, like conflicts about whether to spend resources on like colonizing space or something, as opposed to spending them on Earth. And like also, I mean, Matt mentioned conflict resolution earlier, and I think that, yeah, like I do think that look, poverty, or maybe more precisely, the combination of poverty and affluence, is probably the main driver of violent crime. I actually don't have any doubt about that it is, but it's not the only one. It's not the only thing that leads anybody to act towards acts of interpersonal violence. I mean, like that would exist in any society. And I hope the answer to that wouldn't just be sort of personal vigilantism.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, domestic violence is an obvious example where it's up and down the income ladder. So,
right. And yeah, certainly drug abuse. I mean, I think that it's, again, that's definitely a lot of that is fueled by poverty, but also like realistically, lots of rich people have drug problems. So like that does suggest that there are other causes of that happen. And then like, again, I could imagine a super egalitarian society where poverty was long since a thing of the past or whatever, having intense political conflicts about like how paternalistic or how libertarian to be about drug abuse, you know, in that, you know, that example.
Even look at how heated people get about what kind of houses people are allowed to build. That's in our current society, and that seems like it would continue. I think people would still be fighting online about whether you could have a 10-story apartment and how luxurious the finishes should be allowed to be, you know.
The final political fight between NIMBYs and YIMBYs once everything else is withered away.
That'll be it. That'll be that's all we'll be fighting about anymore.
There won't even be landlords anymore. They'll just be conflicts about whether to, you know, whether you keep the like historic neighborhood the way it is or not.
Yeah. No, I mean that would be all Nathan would write about. It. Current affairs would just be about preserving all the historical buildings. You know how important that is. That would all be it. That's all he's had left.
That would be its only cause at that point.
Yeah, that's it. Everything else would have been resolved. You
know. Just out of curiosity, do you actually like? I know some of what you think about the sort of contemporary debates about this and the society that we live in. But I mean, do you have any thoughts about housing under socialism?
I do actually. No, I have this idea. Well, it's sort of the social wealth fund, but for housing. I've only floated this a few times, but you know, geez, what was his name? The guy who's running for governor now for Texas, and he almost won the Senate race. Do you remember his name? Beto. Yeah, Beto's father-in-law, who was like a billionaire or whatever, invented the real estate investment trust. And you could kind of create a public model for a real estate investment trust, and that would be a way to start sucking in properties to bring them into public ownership, houses and housing units. I've written about that before, but we published a paper at PPP. One of our first few papers actually was targeted at this question, because this was a roiling question even then, and we were like, we've got it. We've got a solution that will, the left can line up behind. And the paper was called Social Housing for America. And it was basically just the idea, hey, look, if we've got these housing shortages, we're not, there's a tendency that says we don't want the developers, want to put money in developer pockets. We don't want to put money in landlord pockets. There's all this kind of hesitation. Very easy solution. Create these new units publicly that will help resolve the supply issue. You can also build them however you want. If you're worried about all these high-end finishes and whatever, you can create some very middle-brow utilitarian buildings. You can cross-subsidize rents to have a mixed income type situation. So mixed income, social housing, solve our supply problem without running into these other issues that, so perturb the left. And, that's actually been one of our most successful papers, at least in terms of local legislators and campaigners and stuff pick it up, and you have to see it all over the place, like the big social housing bill that went down in California. I mean, it failed, but the sponsor there was tweeting that paper. It's like a paper from 4 or 5 years ago. He was tweeting it while he was pushing his campaign, and I think it was called Homes for All, or the Homes Guarantee, or something like that Bernie adopted, was all kind of sourced from that paper initially. Obviously, it's not our idea. Social housing has been around for a very long time, but I think we can claim we have some rightful claim for saying we help inject it into this, moment. So yeah, social housing is where we've wound up. So.
Fair enough. Jake, is there anything else you wanted to bring up here?
No, I think we could get to. You said you had some of the inter-left.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just go ahead and do the self-indulgent thing, because we've done all of the sort of the kind of like big questions that I think I think most people are most likely to ask. So is thinking about sort of specific ways that that models of socialism, or something that we might think of, with whatever caveats about how vague this is a fully socialist society, might work. One that I think that I'm very fond of, and I think you've been, much more critical of, although I'm not quite sure, is the kind that David Schweikart proposes in his book After Capitalism, which roughly says, I think Schweikart, thinks that there are some things that should just be like conventionally state-owned and whatever, but like as far as the sort of market sector of the economy, the model that he proposes, you'd have things that were like really existing co-ops on the firm level, that they'd be worker-owned firms, but for a variety of reasons, it's not just that you'd have an economy that was exactly like this one, except somehow worker-owned firms would be dominant within it, which I actually think would be really hard to do for a lot of reasons, but that you'd have state-owned banks that would be that the sort of would essentially own the physical means of production and kind of rent them out to the state-owned firms. Or a different way of thinking about it is that the state-owned firms would just give, like, starter capital would just come from grants from state-owned firms, but then, which would be like loans, but you wouldn't have to pay back the principal. You just have to sort of do the equivalent of sort of interest payments or a special tax, depending on how you thought about it. So, which would be another way, I think, of combining, some of the goals that, I think in what you laid out earlier, you were combining that, like, in other words, okay, socialists care about workplace democracy, but they're also maybe a lot of reasons that we want the state to have a bigger role in the economy as opposed to just different groups of individual workers. I'm not sure how good a job I've done in giving people a sense of how this model works, but I mean that's roughly it. And I think you've got some criticisms of that, and I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I have read that book. What struck me about that book was, as you point out, so I think it maybe is useful to break the question down into 3 questions when it comes to sort of socialism, right? And it's going to be 1, who gets the profit of each firm, right? Number 2, who elects the board. We'll just make it simple. And then number 3, how are wages and conditions, going to be set? And one of the kind of conventional co-op answer was essentially the workers in each firm get the profits in each firm. The workers in each firm elect the board, and obviously the workers set their own wages in this. Sort of, and he comes back and he says, so one of the critiques is going to be, well, should the workers in each firm get the profits of each firm? That doesn't seem quite right because of the different capital intensities and all that kind of stuff, right? There are some firms that have literally millions of dollars of profit per worker and some that only have a few thousand. It's really got nothing to do with the worker. And so he comes back and he says, I'm going to solve that through, I think he calls it a capital tax or something like that. But essentially each firm is going to be required to send money back up to the central government that essentially approximates the profit. It's not going to be their profit. So he essentially allows for firms to have super profits that like go above and beyond what you would kind of predict them to profit based on the kind of firm they are. And I suppose that maintains certain production incentives and stuff. But other than the super profits, really the kind of main profit is going to go up to the central government. And so in that way, he actually modifies the traditional co-op model to make it look like a social wealth fund model as far as profits go. Because the profits are going up to the state-owned banks or to the state-owned fund, whether it's an equity share or debt share, however you define it. The profits are going out of the firm. And I think that's a good decision. I think that's wise. And I also thought that was very confirming when I read it. I was like, yes, okay, yes. Where he sees the problem, I see the problem. We just kind of went different ways on how to solve it. For who elects the board, it's the workers in each firm. So you would just have 100% of the boards. But those workers, because of this capital tax, they are constrained by that. So they're operating within the constraints that they have to shovel a certain amount of money out of the firm each year, regardless of how profitable or productive it is. They got to shovel that money out of the firm. So in a way, yeah, the workers control the board, but they don't control one of the key decisions, one of the key levers that the board usually has some discretion over, right? Because they're being subjected to this capital tax. So, I wouldn't say, well, therefore the state kind of has a quasi-board seat. I don't want to go that far, but like in a way that the workers are diminished in their ability to really exert control at the board level. And then when it comes to setting the terms and the wages, it's the same kind of thing. You're still constrained a bit by the capital share that's being shoveled out of the firm. But also on that line, I would like to see wages and conditions set sectorally, not set in each firm. So, like I said, you can chop all 3 of those levels up. To me, the most notable thing was he recognized that you had to get that profit out of the firm for fairness and equality reasons. And so, like I said, in many ways, like if you start from the co-op model and you make a few changes, you wind up in a kind of social wealth fund model and vice versa. Because it's really just about changing these, discrete questions, which you can move all sorts of ways. Like I said, with the board, you can go crazy with the board if you want,
Yeah, I mean, so one way of thinking about, I think there are a couple reasons maybe for the modifications that Schweikart has to like a pure co-op model. Like one of which is about kind of broader socioeconomic equality, like you're talking about, and then another is just as a matter of practicality. I don't like if you could sort of, I don't know, you have a genie in a lamp, and you say, okay, I'm a socialist. What do I care about? I care about workplace equality. So my wish for the genie is going to be that every company that's I don't know, sole proprietorship or corporation that exists right now is just going to become a worker controlled firm, like immediately. Then like one concern you could have about that practically is just like, okay, but would that even how long would that actually last? Like if that just magically happened, if you had to just sort of in the course of market competition between a bunch of firms, which were all worker owned, would it, as the sort of ups and downs of competition happened, if like you could, like people would, you could see, especially depending on, I don't know, I guess, even if it were like, even if like the banks especially were just also their own worker controlled firms, but they were just private firms that were out for profit, whatever, whether all their incentives would line up in the right way, that they would want to like sort of continue to have worker ownership everywhere forever, right? It might just not be a stable, viable thing in the long term. Whereas if you have these socialized institutions, these like, well, not, these state-owned institutions that are in charge of giving out the initial grants, that might just be a way of having a sort of more stable way of keeping, worker ownership and, in place in the long term. But I mean, I guess,
Yeah, there's a political case. I would say this is one of the stronger cases for co-ops and similar, which is that, if you have a state-owned enterprise, then, with elections, it's easy to undo that. Privatization is very easy to do. But if you have socialized institutions that are not explicitly state-owned, we can say in principle the state could unwind that, but it's a lot trickier kind of thing to do because you've created a worker-owned institution within the kind of private property parameters of the system, and therefore they would have a hard time like getting rid of that, without unwinding the other parts of the system. So one good example of this is the community land trusts. And Bernie actually, I think he wrote this. I don't know why this is in my head, but I came across this at one point. When he was mayor of Burlington, he helped create a community land trust, which is basically you set aside some land, you put some houses on it. The land is technically owned by like a nonprofit, and they charge a little bit of rent, but really the idea here is to kind of permanently stabilize the price of these homes, so the prices don't really go up at all, and you can buy them, but when you resell them, you can only resell them for a certain amount, and it just kind of keeps them permanently affordable in a way. And one question is, well, why did you set this up as like a nonprofit that owns? Why not just have the city of Burlington? And the answer was, well, we create this separate institution, and it becomes very hard to get rid of it. The next mayor could undo our public thing and like sell it off and whatever, but since we chartered a separate corporation that's technically private, and then it's kind of insulated from that. I would say that's probably the strongest argument for these non-governmental approaches. It's just that they are more insulated from political tides potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think the worry in the case of co-ops, without something like socialized banking backing them up, is not that the government is gonna somehow come in and say we're gonna forbid you from having a co-op or whatever, which is the sort of thing that, like, I don't know, in my experience, libertarians often really like to emphasize, hey, nobody's stopping you from having a worker co-op, which is true, right? That nobody's going to pass a law against having that 1% of the economy be worker co-ops. It's just that there are a bunch of economic facts that prevent you from doing it. But But yeah, I don't think the concern would be so much about the state undoing it as just the sort of natural churn of markets undoing it. That as people,
and the workers in the firm. That's all. That's actually been a big problem with co-ops historically is demutualization, as they call it. If the workers in the firm own the equity in the firm and the firm is doing really well, I think there was like a steel factory I'm remembering that was sort of like this. And, we've created a nice $50 million company, but we can't really cash that out unless we demutualize and sell the shares.
Yeah, I mean, New Belgium Brewing, right? The Fat Tire, they were a maybe not exactly what people have in mind when you say worker co-op, but at least I think there was a employee stock ownership plan that owned the whole thing, and then whatever. I mean, you can't feel too bad for them. I think everybody got rich, but like they sold that to something else, and so yeah. I mean, I think that's a major concern about that. So I mean, I guess one way of thinking about this would be that if you kind of start from a pure co-op model, then you end up seeing, okay, we have these problems about institutional stability, we have this problem about sure, like you said, right wingers win elections too, but I mean also if you have stuff that leads to lots of social benefits, then the hope would be it's really popular and it makes it hard to get rid of in the long term. But you have the concern about political stability. You have the concern about like large sectoral or just firm to firm economic inequality. So you can solve that by having some sort of special capital tax that that redistributes away some of that capital income. But on the other hand, if you're just starting with regular companies just being owned by the state outright on the post office model, or being just organized as corporations, but having, all the chunks of those corporations owned by social wealth funds, then you've got the workplace democracy model, and, and the sort of, you've got the workplace democracy concern for the sake of which, in your case, maybe you're sort of doing the mirror image of the Schweikart thing there and say, well, okay, let's go in and make this a little bit more like a co-op.
Yeah. The workers would have their power through their union and through co-determination, through board seats. The same way that they kind of have the power in his model is through board seats. But they have more board seats in his than in a typical co-determination. But their board seats are actually more constrained because they have to pay the capital tax and operate within that constraint. So, it's almost more of a question of how many board seats do you want to give them, and how do you want to organize the wage bargaining? Like that's it's almost like not even a socialism or not. It's just like, how do you want to set those dials? You might even come up with different answers for different industries. I know in Germany, with their co-determination, some sectors have there are some sectors, I think it's the mining sectors, where it's 50-50. The workers get 50% and the owners get 50%. And then if there's a tie, like a government official will break the tie. And then in others, it's like 20% or 30% or whatever. So, yeah. I think that's really the question for worker empowerment, is really almost just how many board seats should they get? Also remembering, again, like, do we think that workers in each firm, should they be the sole controller of the firm? Like we start from a premise like, yeah, that would be ideal, but maybe we might need to change it for practical. Is that ideal? There are people who don't work in the firm who also obviously have a stake in its success and what it's doing, how it's producing, externalities. So
I mean, all of the kind of models that were discussed tonight are ultimately, models what people would think of as market socialism, just meaning that like a kind of socialism where you still have markets, which you might, like whether or not you have to have that constraint or not is obviously a huge controversy in itself. But you might at least think that for the time being, right? Maybe someday supercomputers will deliver us red plenty, and we don't have to, we can do without that part, right? But maybe for now, you need markets. But I mean, even if you do drop that assumption, I mean, even if you're just thinking about like some really real traditional socialist ideas about how all this would work, where somehow or another there's just state planning that doesn't need to, you don't need to have the sort of feedback loops of what prices people are willing to pay and all that stuff. You can just do without all that. You still have this tension between two goals that socialists traditionally care about, which are, workplace democracy is something people care about a lot, right? Workers control production, but also something like the idea that as a society we should be collectively determining the course of the economy and the course of our collective social lives in a way that it's not under capitalism. And I don't think you have to pick. I think those are two goals that actually do matter. But like I do think that there's some tension between them. I mean, any way of fulfilling, I think that there are probably at some point some trade-offs that you have to have between, okay, what do you actually want to be controlled by this particular group of workers at this workplace, and what do you want to be controlled by society as a whole because it affects everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's a matter of assigning, weight, to each of those people, like ultimately in a kind of compromised way. You want social control, you want worker control. Where they conflict, you have to hash that out and figure out, how we're going to weigh these kinds of things, remembering that workers are also voters in the government as well. So they are, in a way, proportionally represented in that slice, in addition to their direct representation on the board. So
fair enough. Matt, where can people find your stuff? You mentioned PPP earlier, which is a term, which is an abbreviation that stands for something else in this context that it does in many others. So want to tell people about that?
Yes, the think tank I am the president of, People's Policy Project, which you can go to peoplespolicyproject.org. And then I also have a podcast I do with my wife called The Bruenigs, which you can look up on Patreon. So
very nice. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right. That was Matt Bruenig, who I've been a fan of for a long time. So it was cool to do this. I called into the call-in once, but this is definitely the most extended conversation we've had. So that was great. Jake didn't care for him, but he managed to put up a good front. So in a minute, we're going to go to the post game with our good friend Jean Bajalan, who is, we're going to talk about the uprising in Iran and why Jean is pretty sure that every single Iranian person who thinks they're upset about theocracy and gender apartheid is actually being personally mind controlled by the CIA. I might be getting that wrong. That might not be his thesis, but we'll find out in the post game for patrons. Also, he when he was in Atlanta, he gave me some candy from a store in his hometown in the UK. So I'm going to try it in the post game. We're going to find out if it's better or worse than our American candies, like candy corn. So that'll be exciting for everybody. But before we go to the post game, I do want to just plug two things. One is the live show again in Los Angeles. So really looking forward to this. This is going to be a week from this coming Sunday. So this is going to be on October 23rd at 7 p.m. LA time at the Terragram Ballroom in Los Angeles. With this show jointly sponsored with This Is Revolution and Left Reckoning, which are definitely two of my favorite other left podcasts. Excited to be collaborating with those guys. Also, for anybody who is a fan of the old Weekends show on Jacobin, both of the people who are hosts of that, Nando Vila and Anna Kasparian, are going to be guests on it. So in a way, we're that's a four podcast thing, even if one of them isn't operative right now, and a lot of my other favorite people are going to be there. Ryan, Varn, Bessner. So should be a very good time. We're still planning out all the stuff that's there, but you can get tickets by following that link in the description for this episode. Meanwhile, if you are not a patron of the show, and if you are a patron of the show, I don't know, well, everybody involved will hug you in Los Angeles, whatever. We'll that's or we'll just say thank you as the case may be. But if you are not a patron of the show, you can go to patreon.com/Ben Burgess, and you can become a patron for $5 a month, and you get those post games after all the regular Monday night episodes every week. Sometimes we do exclusive things for patrons, or we release things to patrons early. You get access to the Discord server, and most importantly, you get our undying love and appreciation for.
We also say things too spicy for the main show with the help of some alcohol at times. So just as a little plug for to find out what Ben really thinks about certain issues, you got to become a patron, right?
That's right. It gets ugly, but it's all real. Yeah, absolutely. There are things that we have covered in the post game that we don't.
Yeah, not being 100% sarcastic. I'm saying it's a fun time for sure if anyone's not currently subscribing.
Fair enough. Well, I just heard from Gene that his baby is asleep, so we can start up the post game. So if you are already a patron, you should see a link to the post game there. If you are not, no time like the present, and I will see people there in just a moment. Left is best.